we give the Ukrainians the JASSM, number one, it's great because we have a lot of JASSMs. We have a fairly large stockpile that we can use relative to ATACMs, which we have relatively fewer of. And then number two, that will substantially increase Ukraine's ability to do this battlefield air interdiction by using it not only for air defense, but using the platform for air-to-ground attacks.
I want to come on to some of the things we've been seeing from the Kremlin in recent weeks in a moment. But first of all, I mean, it's interesting how 6 or 7 weeks ago, a lot of these discussions were dominated by the arrival of the F-16s in Ukraine, and then that kind of got overtaken by the offensive operation in Kursk. Have we seen any evidence of the F-16s making a noticeable difference on the front line in recent weeks?
Yeah, difficult to say. Again, we've seen the Ukrainians use fixed-wing aircraft to support the operations in Kursk. They've been using, American-provided Jdam bombs to take out bridges over the Sam River, which is important for, doing what we call battlefield air interdiction, or BAI, essentially geographically isolating sections of the battlefield to prevent adversaries from getting in or out when you're trying to conduct operations there. So that's a new and interesting capability. It's not clear to me if it's F-16s that are flying those missions to drop the JDAMs, or if different Ukrainian pilots are using Ukrainian Soviet-era MiGs that are been retrofitted to accept the JDAM to launch those. But really, the platform isn't important, because when you give them more bandwidth to operate aircraft, you increase the capabilities to operate in the air domain. And capabilities are always more important than individuals, named systems. The primary thing that I think the F-16s are doing, and I base this off of this public statements from Ukrainian officials, is they're using the F-16s primarily for air defense at this time. They augment the Ukrainian air defense umbrella, and they use them to intercept, missiles, enemy drones, that sort of thing. So, insofar as they play a role in air defense, it's very difficult to actually see that, because you can see the strikes on bridges, you can see when they drop the bombs on the ground-based targets, because usually there's footage of that. But when it gets rolled up into the larger defensive game, as part of the larger air defense umbrella, augmenting the Patriots and the German-provided systems and all the other stuff, and they just shoot down drones and that sort of thing, it's difficult to sort of disaggregate the role that the F-16s play. But nonetheless, it's an important capability. And right now, one of the Pentagon debates is about, do we give the Ukrainians the JASSM? It's an air-launched cruise missile. With a range that exceeds that of ATACMs. And if we give the Ukrainians the JASSM, number one, it's great because we have a lot of JASSMs. We have a fairly large stockpile that we can use relative to ATACMs, which we have relatively fewer of. And then number two, that will substantially increase Ukraine's ability to do this battlefield air interdiction by using it not only for air defense, but using the platform for air-to-ground attacks.
I mean, I suppose that does raise the question, George, and I'm not necessarily asking you to speculate on the internal decision-making in the White House, but if the US have more JASSMs and they're longer range than the ATACMs, why hasn't that been considered before?
Truthfully, I don't know the answer, because the go-to reason has been they're concerned about escalation, and to what extent they're actually genuinely concerned about that versus they hide behind fears of escalation as sort of the rhetorical justification for other reasons is unclear to me. And I really don't know. I've spoken with policymakers who have been actually genuinely concerned about the risk of, catastrophic horrors, vertical escalation in Ukraine, like the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon or something, which is very unlikely, or, the Russians escalating horizontally and then saying, all right, look, American and NATO intelligence support and facilitate these attacks through collection and targeting support for the Ukrainian military, making them de facto parties to the conflict, and therefore we're going to start retaliating by striking NATO, right? Like that's another kind of escalation that we want to avoid, that we're concerned about as well. And I don't know which is which, or to what extent the policymakers are grappled by that. Another reason has to do with the bureaucratic politics within the Pentagon. Whenever we want to pull away resources from one stockpile, right, those are in principle earmarked for contingency plans for different combatant commands, for different commanders, and you decrease American readiness when you send these weapons. Now, I would argue that, look, it's better to use weapons that we pay for and have an inventory for the real war that has serious implications for NATO and American interests, as opposed to, say, the hypothetical war that might occur but is not happening now, and would more likely happen if the adversaries perceive that the United States will not treat current wars seriously, and you can indeed bully them and get them to not be decisive about defeating current wars. So it's a combination of these factors, and I wish I could tell you, but we continue to boil the frog. We continue to make the right decision, sort of a day late and a dollar short. And I hope that we will do the right thing vis-a-vis JASSMs and eventually ATACMs, because the Ukrainians need that capability.
Just wanted to ask you, George, about something that the ISW mentions in your latest Russian offensive campaign assessment, which is how the Kremlin has been leveraging the weekend's Russian regional elections to try and get veterans of the war in Ukraine into leadership positions in Russia. And partly you say that's because of concerns the Kremlin may have about domestic support for the war. I mean, a lot of people have focused on that since the incursion into Kursk. How big an issue do you think that is for Putin, that he's worried about how the war is perceived internally?
Putin was a KGB officer in the late Soviet period, in the late 80s, when Glasnost and Perestroika were going on, and there was more political freedom, more freedom of thought and exchange. And it was actually some of those reforms that Gorbachev undertook. Gorbachev didn't want to blow up or destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted to have a reformation to make Soviet communism essentially work better. But that dose of more political freedom, political organization, freedom of information proved lethal, because you started to have people questioning the government myths, questioning throughout the legacy of the Soviet Union, the narrative that the state was putting out there, the history of the state, just abusing the population, and then also with the war in Afghanistan, with a whole bunch of killed Russians over the course of a decade in a foreign war that was not going well. The mothers of killed service members started to actually create, civil society organizations and hold demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, and that sort of thing. And the Soviet police state was not willing to crack down upon that. So Putin's very alive to the fact that, look, when you have a cleavage of society, of which Russian veterans are going to become a sizable portion, especially not just veterans that, sort of served, did their time, got out. We're talking about veterans that are wounded, many of whom who have serious life-altering injuries, like missing a limb or permanently crippled, right? They no longer fight. When you return those people to society, and now they have to rely on a support system of the state and their community and their families, this has essentially created a new political cleavage within Russia, which is a liability for the Kremlin, especially in the long term, and especially if among these people, there becomes a prevalent idea of, like, why the hell are we fighting this war in Ukraine, into the third year, into the fourth year, into the fifth year, if we're not achieving our objectives, right? And so I think what the Kremlin's doing is they've launched a clear campaign. It's called the Times of Heroes initiative, where they essentially are trying to incorporate Russian veterans into political life. They're trying to get them involved in governance at the local level, at the federal level. They're trying to get them involved in, hearing complaints of the community, from shaping government policies. And this gives this new political cleavage, some degree of agency in policy making. It helps them feel that they're not being ignored or isolated by the state. It actually brings them into the fold and gives them some privileges and powers, both political and monetary, right? And what that does is essentially it co-opts this cleavage so that it actually becomes a reinforcing arm of the state, as opposed to a potential liability that could help turn the tide against the current state policy. So it's very intelligent, it's very smart, and it's helping Putin, protract this war effort for as long as he wants to.
But it's also fascinating how clearly Putin is worried about making too much of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. He wants to play it down almost. And you point out that the Russian regional elections would have been the perfect moment to get rid of the current acting governor of Kursk Oblast. But he doesn't want to do that because that would draw attention to what's happening in Kursk. Exactly.
Yeah. So on our update that we published yesterday on September 9, the incumbent governor won. He'll be serving there for another 5 years, so he's avoided a potential outing for now. But it seems the Kremlin political strategy and messaging strategy here is to sort of portray the Kursk incursion as the new normal, to get people used to it, to acclimate them to it, to not have them think and panic over it, because the Russians genuinely can't really do anything about it, as we discussed, in terms of their means. And it was very interesting. There was a lot of messaging from the Russians yesterday saying, look, voter turnout in Kursk was very, very high. Everything's basically hunky dory. We were able to conduct our political processes like normal, and all's good and well. And the governor's been reelected, and sort of the political Potemkin village equivalent of what Catherine the Great would do back in the day. So this is a further indication that, look, you can indeed push back on the Russians. They're actually quite bad at crisis management and preparing for unplanned contingencies, and they sort of sheepishly ad-lib their way through it and then accept the costs and the embarrassments that we impose on them, sort of with their tail tucked between their legs. They don't lash out, and they don't escalate vertically or horizontally in a crazy way.
And I should say, for anyone who's interested, the ISW's Russian offensive campaign assessments every day are essential reading if you're interested in finding out more. George, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James. Always good to see you, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.